Awesome. All right, let's make a start. So hello and welcome to the second webinar we're doing in our series on Alzheimer's disease prevention. So this week and this time we've got a really exciting one in line with the Women's International Day, a little bit earlier, 1 week earlier. However, we are going to be talking about why is the female brain at greater risk of Alzheimer's disease. We've also got a special guest with us in Nian, and she is the co-founder of Work Gym, and she's going to be sharing a little bit more about what she's doing at the end. So make sure you hang around for that, and we will be able to share a little bit more about the incredible stuff she's doing in line with women's health as well. So we're going to start with a little journey. So we're going to take a trip down memory lane. And do you remember a teacher that you got on really well with at school? And then there were teachers you didn't like, but there was always that one student that actually another student did, right? And it's not a one-size-fits-all model. Not every teacher is perfect for every student. And imagine if you could have that same teacher that brought out the best in you for every subject, even your worst subjects. Would things be different? And that's where we are connecting and making the educational system accessible. So as Tutor Hive, we're pioneering the future of education through our innovative and engaging platform to drive both personal growth and development. And we're built on three core things. It's education as an enabler for global development. That technology can make the world a better place. And that everyone deserves a chance to unlock their potential. And so with this in mind, we thought we'd just share a little bit about how it works and how we can help parents find the right tutor first time. But the problem is the average student goes through 3 tutors before finding the right one, which makes it a pretty bad journey, right? Imagine trying to order a dish at a restaurant and it's right, get the wrong dish. Again, get the wrong dish. Again, get the wrong dish. There's fatigue, there's all of that. And it's more expensive. It would cost you £120 on average to find one tutor for the first lesson. Whereas with Tutor Hive and our Hive matching algorithm, it streamlines the process, it finds the right teacher and improves that entire journey, making it cheaper and better for everyone. And we've got a business model that benefits everyone. So one-to-one lessons, a tutor would earn £30, a student would pay £30. But we know that the preference is making these lessons more sociable, more engaging, connecting students and bringing them together to learn in an environment that's best suited for them, where we can get our students to pay only £15 an hour and a tutor to earn £55 an hour. Now, as a business model, for 4 weeks of tutoring, a student only pays £60 and they're in a small, targeted focus group matched to their personality. And the tutor can earn £880. Now, us as a business, Tutor Hive, we've built a business model which is fair and equitable. So with a £55 an hour rate card, we're still able to make £560 just by connecting. And this is where we as a business see a huge opportunity to make the system work and work fairly and equitably for everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Martina, who's going to share a little bit about her experience through neurodegeneration and her journey, what she's doing. And she's going to share a little bit more about how the difference between the male and the female brain and why it's so much more impactful to the female brain and what you can do about it. So really excited to hear this. And thank you, Martina.
Thank you, Rishabh. So welcome. Thank you so much for dialing in. So really just real quick, my motivation for running this, my project and really for doing these webinars is my personal experience with neurodegeneration. So that was not dementia, but still a condition where my cognitive function really just progressively went downhill. And so I know what it's like. And I also know what it's like to come back to life, come back to brain function, entirely with functional medicine intervention. So that is really food and lifestyle. And with that, a very sustainable way of coming back to function, coming back to life. I've started a project doing exactly that, Alzheimer's prevention with food and lifestyle. And I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. But yeah, so this is really my personal motivation to go into Alzheimer's prevention. It's a huge global epidemic. There is no pharmaceutical intervention for prevention or cure, and there simply cannot be by the nature of the disease of Alzheimer's. So that's why I think that we should all know about how to prevent simply by very simple daily food and lifestyle choices. So, Rishabh, could you go to the next slide, please? So in terms of the structure of the webinar, we'll first of all take a high-level overview of Alzheimer's in terms of its risk factors and its types. It's a highly complex risk factor structure, but also highly complex disease. It's de facto not really one disease, but we'll talk about that. Then we'll go high level into the male versus the female brain in terms of function of the brains. And then very specifically, we dive into Alzheimer's and the female brain. So what is special about the female brain? What is it that makes it much more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease? When that happens, so menopause being a crucial time for the female brain when it's becoming very vulnerable to Alzheimer's. And menopause is all about hormonal changes. And these hormonal changes really impact brain and brain function. And so then we talk about what actually disrupts our hormones and what we can do very specifically to avoid this disruption with avoiding certain things in our life, in our environment, and what we can do to support our hormones, estrogen, with food and nutrition in lifestyle choices, really. And the last point I want to touch on, that's a bit more of a controversial point, but it must definitely be talked about, HRT, hormone replacement therapy. And that is really a topic that is very common in menopause to manage the physiological symptoms of menopause. There is some data around what HRT does to cognitive function, but that is very, very varied data and it's quite controversial, but we still have to talk about it because it is simply so incredibly important. And as a last point, I'll talk a bit more about my project. And at the end, the further resources. So for anyone who's interested in reading up on things, there are a number of interesting books and papers and articles that I can very much recommend that will give further insights into the topic. So I guess menopause overall, and of course, any changes in hormonal balance over the life cycle of any person, specifically females. And that is not really something that is talked about much. There's so much misunderstanding and so much shame about menopause. And I think now the world is moving a little bit towards taking it out of this shame corner and making it just discussed openly as a fact of life, as it should be. And next slide, please. So the risk factors of Alzheimer's, for any one of you that has been in this webinar before, you may have seen this slide. So it's very much the overview showing how complicated the risk factors are. It's really multifactorial on the side of risk factors. There you see it's structured by family and age, family history and age, environmental factors, food, and genetics. The black dots on the left-hand side are really the ones talking about genetics. They include the genetics that drive early onset Alzheimer's and late onset Alzheimer's. They're very important to differentiate there. Early onset and late onset are very different diseases. And early onset really starts from the age of 45, incredibly young. But early onset is a very, very rare form of Alzheimer's. Really just 2-3% of all Alzheimer's patients have early onset. And the genes for early onset Alzheimer's are deterministic. So that really means that a patient that has 1 or 2 copies of these specific variants of these 3 genes will have it. That affects Down syndrome patients greatly because they have 3 copies of chromosome 21, which is where one of these genes is located. So, but we talk about late onset here, and that's the great majority of Alzheimer's in the wider population. And the genes in the context of late onset Alzheimer's are not deterministic. So very important, we can affect gene expression of these genes by food and lifestyle choices, with food and lifestyle choices. So I want to stress very much, there is so much we can do, and it's never this concept of it's going to happen. Age is just means that Alzheimer's is a consequence thereof. That's not the case. So that is very important. For me, the very positive message, we can impact our own fate to a great extent. Next slide, please. So here, now as a progression from the overview of the risk factors, here we see the types. Again, late onset, so the common type. And so we have 5 bubbles here. You'll see 6 text paragraphs. So depending on who you follow, you will hear about 5 types or 6 types. Here I'm following the logic of Dale Bredesen, who is one of the pioneers of Alzheimer's prevention and Alzheimer's cure, actually, with food and lifestyle. And he takes the view it's 5 times, but one is type 1A and 1B. Okay, so just really to give you this full overview, each patient is different. So very likely each patient will have one or more than one of these types. Some have 2, some have all 5 or 6, however you want to define that. And these types here are, the logic of these types here is really by trigger. And you'll see the inflammatory one, so it's chronic inflammation, usually starting in the gut, that travels to the brain, and an inflamed brain is a very problematic brain that we definitely want to avoid, not only in the Alzheimer's context, but of course also for the Alzheimer's context. Glycotoxic, that type is all around the inability of the body to balance blood sugar, so insulin resistance, and diabetes 2, and that is problematic for the brain. If diabetes 2 remains unchecked for a while, it will likely turn into diabetes 3, which is Alzheimer's, which is diabetes of the brain. But diabetes 2 is reversible, and insulin resistance is reversible with food and lifestyle. So again, a positive message. The hard work is what we need to do, but we can. The point here that I marked in red, the atrophic type, that is really where the female version is really falls really into. The female version that we're talking about here very specifically is the drop in estrogen in menopause. And atrophic or trophic factors are really the nutrition factors that we need for different organs. And so the trophics that we need for the brain are certain nutrients like magnesium, zinc, and so on, but of course, hormones, neurotransmitters. And that is why the type that we're talking about here, the very specific type, is really in the atrophic, or belongs to the atrophic type. The next one is the traumatic type, where patients have received one or several severe knocks to the head. So brain trauma is a type, or a brain that has been physically traumatized. That is a type that again is reversible, but has to be approached in a different way than the other types. The vascular one is really cardiovascular disease in the brain, if you will, in a very simplistic way. The toxic type is a brain that has been exposed to heavy metals such as mercury, arsenic, cadmium, lead, all these things. Heavy metals cannot really be metabolized by the body at all because they are completely foreign substances. So they are either tried to be excreted or they will end up staying in the body, being stored in fat cells. Again, the brain is mainly fat. The part that is not water is mainly fat. And so we want to avoid any toxins being stored in our fatty tissues to really reduce our risk for Alzheimer's as much as possible. But as I said, here we're talking, focusing really on the atrophic type, the type where we have a hormonal imbalance in the body and brain. Next slide, please. So going from the different types, how Alzheimer's can essentially lead to be manifested in the brain. That is really the overview of what we can do as humans, male and female, to support our brain health. Very much things we can do on a daily basis. So the white font really applies to all people. The pink one is very specifically applicable to the female brain. So it's really food and lifestyle, sleep, meditation, stress management, physical and mental exercise, community and purpose, social connections. And I think isolation is a huge problem. It's now recognized as a huge problem, a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's that we definitely want to avoid. But of course, here in the context of the female brain, it's very specifically hormonal balance. And of course, HRT with a big question mark needs to be talked about, but there's not a simple answer to that. Next slide, please. Right, so now we've talked a bit about the brain in general, but now really, what is it that makes the female brain so different from the male brain? Now, first of all, the male and female brain are organically very, very similar, but they're functionally very different, and that really changes over the life cycle of a person. Even though the differences are already very clear for a male or a female fetus in utero, but when born, a small child up to puberty or up to the conclusion of puberty, the brains are very similar. But then with puberty and the excretion, or the secretion rather, of the sex-specific hormones, the brain functions very differently between male and female. And then post-menopause, the two brains converge again functionally very closely. There are always going to be differences between the male and the female brain, though, in terms of susceptibility to certain diseases. On the blue side there, on the little visual, you'll see the male brain is more susceptible to conditions like antisocial behavior, alcoholism, and also Parkinson's. And the female brain is more susceptible to depression, anxiety, multiple sclerosis, but also Alzheimer's. So that really gives a very high level overview, what is similar, what is different in terms of the female brain. But I think we know very clearly the female brain is very much, the function is very, very, very impacted by the hormones and the changes in hormones that a female will experience in her whole body during the whole life cycle, but also the monthly cycle. Next slide, please. So we've talked about hormones now, just to put that a bit into context. So the endocrine system of the human body, that is really all hormones and all the tissues and glands that produce and secrete hormones. So that is really one system, and that is very much about balance. So if one hormone, one neurotransmitter, one chemical is out of balance, that affects the function of the whole system, so of our brain and our whole body. So that's why the endocrine system is a very sensitive system, and that is something that we definitely need to look out for much more than we do in the current Western world, where we're constantly exposed to certain substances that disrupt our endocrine system. So to give you a quick overview of how incredibly important hormones are. So first of all, hormones are chemical messengers, and they really affect anything and everything in our body. So anything from metabolism and homeostasis, so making sure that the body works, and really all the autonomic functions like blood pressure, blood sugar, electrolytes, breathing, digestion, body temperature, all those things that that we're not even aware of, that just happen. So that is really driven by hormones and neurotransmitters, but also the growth and development, obviously over the life cycle, sleep and wake cycle, mood, as we famously know for anyone who has a severe hormonal imbalance. And of course, the one thing that everybody will associate immediately with hormones is sexual function and reproduction. But of course, hormones are so much more than just that one part of the of the human. Next slide, please. So here we have an overview of all the different glands and tissues in the body that secrete hormones. And here we're focusing very specifically on the glands in the brain. So that's the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland that produce various hormones and that ensure that they will connect to certain receptors in order to function properly. But you'll see there are so many more organs that are part of the endocrine system. So the only thing that is really different is the reproductive organs of male and female. And very importantly, actually, just to be very clear that testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are 3 hormones that both genders, male and female, must have. Of course, males have more testosterone and females have more estrogen, but we all have to have all 3 in the right balance. So that is very important. So it's not just a matter of boosting testosterone, and that's a good thing for a male. It has to be in the right balance. So that's really just a small piece just to remind. Was there a question? No question? Okay. Next slide, please. Right, so we've seen now where the hormones are produced and secreted. And so here we see an overview of the hormone levels of a female over her life cycle. From birth, and the level is flat and low, not slow. And in puberty, we start to see hormones being produced and secreted. And they stay at a very high level consistently over the reproductive years. And then in perimenopause, they start to reduce. We see both estrogen and progesterone, estrogen here in the American spelling, by the way, and we see them in perimenopause reducing. And where I put the red arrow, that is really the big drop in estrogen, and that is when the brain really is challenged in terms of its cognitive function, because estrogen has such a hugely important role in the brain. Next slide, please. So the role of estrogen in the brain, it is very, very far-reaching, and it goes much, much, much further than anything to do just with reproduction. So that is something that is not yet enough known, I think, in general. So estrogen increases synaptic and dendritic spine density in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is essentially 2 small structures very much in the center of our brain. And that is very, very important for memory formation, memory recall. So the hippocampus is really something that we want to absolutely make sure to take really good care of. So the estrogen has such an important role, specifically for the density of the hippocampus. So hippocampi, it's actually 2 little structures. Estrogen is a potent antioxidant, meaning that it will remove any free radicals, any damage that has been left behind from anything that has been oxidized. Oxygen is a very reactive substance, so oxygen will bind to other substances very easily, and with that break apart molecules. And these broken apart molecules are free radicals that very likely cause cell damage. So in order to avoid cell damage, the body needs antioxidants. And estrogen is a very potent antioxidant in the brain. And that, of course, is something that we definitely need. So that is a hugely important function of estrogen that is probably never talked about enough. Another role of estrogen in the brain is that it affects the metabolism of serotonin and dopamine. And these are 2 neurotransmitters that I think are being talked about greatly with anything of what drives a human to actually achieve something, the hormone of pursuit, if you will. And I think the differentiation that I've used here, serotonin and dopamine, happiness versus pleasure, I think that is a very important thing to differentiate Serotonin is about happiness, which is a long-term feeling. Pleasure is very much a short-term feeling. And serotonin drives pro-social behavior. So that's very much the cooperation between people to be very dynamic together. Dopamine driving pleasure, and that is very much the hormone, the neurotransmitter hormone of pursuit, which is oftentimes associated with a little bit more of an, not antisocial, but a little bit more of a selfish behavior. But in any case, these two things are what is generally called the feel-good hormones or neurotransmitters, and they are very much affected by estrogen. And of course, serotonin is very much implicated. The wrong level, so not just too low, but the wrong level of serotonin is very much implicated in depression, which we now know that is the female brain is much more susceptible to depressive moods. Of course, with estrogen dropping, we're at higher risk. Another neurotransmitter that is affected by estrogen or metabolized by estrogen is acetylcholine, and that you may have heard about in the context of Alzheimer's pharmaceuticals on the market that at this stage are entirely modifying neurotransmitters, and acetylcholine is one that is very much focused on memory function and retention, that is why it's important in the brain and in optimal brain function, cognitive function. Estrogen is also responsible for cerebral blood flow, so that really means blood flow in the brain, so essentially supplying oxygen to the brain, incredibly important. It affects the aging of brain regions. Clinical trials were done with male and female brains of the same chronological age. And with the drop of estrogen, the female brain in certain brain areas was showing greater signs of aging than the male brain. So that is really very interesting how that functions in terms of the aging process. Estrogen is obviously very much implicated in neurodegeneration, such as Alzheimer's in the female brain. Next slide, please. Right. So we now know what the role of estrogen in the healthy young brain is, or the roles rather are. And now menopause, meaning estrogen has dropped. And now the brain has to suddenly deal with a situation where one of the trophic factors, so one of the nutrients, estrogen, is so much more scarce. So the impact of that scarcity of estrogen on the brain, estrogen and progesterone, I should say, on the brain is really a number of things. So menopause in itself, in terms of definition, is really a progressive transition of the brain in terms of its structure, connectivity, and metabolic profile from the pre-menopause stage to the post-menopause stage. There are substantial differences in those different stages of perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. I think there's a lot of detail here on this slide, but I think there are two things that I definitely want to highlight very much in the spirit of menopause is not great fun, but it's not all bad news, in that the gray matter volume actually recovers post-menopause. So we're post the drop of estrogen, meaning, so we have gray matter and white matter in the brain. Gray matter is where actual processing happens, and white matter is really where the communication of gray matter is facilitated, if you will. So the actual processing tissue in the brain is recovered post-menopause by itself. Again, we need to support it with the right nutrients and minerals and the optimal food for the brain, if you will. But I think that is a very important and encouraging point. And the last point there, I want to stress again, that 2 points there really. On the one hand, it is saying amyloid beta deposition is more pronounced in women that carry ApoE4 variant 4, 1 or 2 copies. And I think in this statement, there are two things that need to be clarified, and the scariness needs to be taken away. One, amyloid beta in itself is not, that's not Alzheimer's. Amyloid beta is a very natural and healthy immune response in the brain. So the brain has its own immune system. It's called the glymphatic system. And so when the glymphatic system recognizes any sort of substance as an invader that needs to be removed, it will deploy amyloid beta proteins. And so amyloid beta in itself, that is a natural situation. We all have, as we speak, amyloid beta in the brain, and that is fine. That in itself has no cognitive impairment as a consequence. Alzheimer's is very much about amyloid beta plaques, so large accumulations, while tau tangles, tau protein tangles are present. Those two things together, that is problematic. But amyloid beta by itself, that is not something to get all crazy about. And amyloid beta is still being talked about so much. And Biogen and Incyte, those two companies that are researching pharmaceuticals for Alzheimer's, still obsess about amyloid beta and amyloid beta removal. These drugs, two drugs, have been recently talked about, aducanumab and lecanemab. Those two drugs are focusing on removal of amyloid beta. They do nothing for cognition because amyloid beta has nothing to do with cognitive decline. That's just a side note. So that's one thing to let go of, this fear of amyloid beta. And the other point here is really ApoE4 variant 4. It's a gene that is implicated with higher risk, but we can impact gene expression with food and lifestyle. So just really to take away this constant fear of anyone that has ApoE4 variant 4. It's not a great thing, but it just is to be taken as a greater incentive to really watch food and lifestyle and make the right choices in order to decrease their risk. Next slide, please. So this statement, hormonal changes load the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. I think that is quite an interesting concept, and I really like this. Probably a very American statement, but I really like that in that certain hormonal changes we cannot really do anything about. Menopause is not something that we can stop, but we can make otherwise choices that will not exacerbate these hormonal imbalances. And here on the list, there are a number of things that really exacerbate hormonal imbalances, and with that, we put ourselves, our body, at huge risk of chronic disease, not just Alzheimer's, but also Alzheimer's. So things that we can, of course, very easily address is nutritional deficiencies, or making a choice about smoking or alcohol, detoxifying our body, watching our stress, managing our stress, sleeping better, exercising. Thyroid function is a bit more involved. That usually will take quite a bit of functional testing and really understanding what the situation is. Usually you can tell easily whether it's hyper or hypothyroid, but what is driving that? Is that an autoimmune condition, or is that driven by external factors? Again, seeing a thyroid specialist will very, very likely solve that problem. And of course, the big issue here, obesity, high blood pressure, the wrong cholesterol being high, the right cholesterol being too low, that is overall called the metabolic syndrome. That is, again, something that seems to sneak in with lots of people in the Western world. The question is always what came first, whether it was obesity and high blood pressure that then disrupted hormones, or whether was it hormone disruption that resulted in obesity. While that is a more involved process than just ensuring nutritional sufficiency, it is absolutely doable, and it's incredibly important to be very clear about the fact that this is not just something that happens and that is something that we need to live with. No, it is something that we can turn around ourselves. We need to speak to people that understand us, that help us. There are a number of incredibly interesting, insightful, and high quality books, and that we can read and understand our own body, or speaking with a functional medicine practitioner, that is absolutely fundamental to lead the body back to function. But it's absolutely possible to do that. So this is just a reminder of all these things that are not a good idea. Next slide, please. Right, so we've seen all these conditions that are either a consequence of hormone disruption, or that will in consequence disrupt our hormones. There are a number of exogenous endocrine disruptors, so disruptors of our hormonal system, that come from the outside, that we can avoid simply by making choices of how we live, what we eat, and what we don't eat. So this is really just an overview. It's not an exhaustive list. Sadly, there's so much more. But it is really all about focusing with household products, personal beauty products, any product that we're constantly exposed to, detergents, that they're organic. So the golden rule is really, where the benchmark is, anything you put on your skin has to be good enough to be eaten. So really anything that you put on your skin ends up in your bloodstream, simply through the pores. So make sure that whatever you put on your skin is something that you would eat. Won't taste great. Even the organic beauty stuff doesn't taste great, but it will be a lot better and less harmful than any commercial and highly toxic things that are very normalized. Just to be very clear, these are not industrial strength crazy things. This is completely normalized household products and detergents. So just to be clear, we just need to know what we surround ourselves with, and avoid where we realize it's highly problematic and toxic. So the list goes on. Solvents, so that can be anything from paint, from any treatment of fabrics that we are exposed to, I don't know, the sofa even. And industrial ingredients can be anything and everything from exhaust fumes to materials that constantly emits tiny amounts, molecules, volatile molecules that we breathe in with that ingest. Pharmaceuticals, that's of course a very big field. The body will always try to detoxify any substance that is foreign to the body, and with that the detox organs, so that's the liver, kidney, the gallbladder, lymphatic system. All these systems will be very stressed. So we need to make sure that we take as little pharmaceuticals as we can justify to ourselves. Make sure that we know what we take. Whatever our doctor prescribes may or may not be as easily digested by our body. So to be very clear. Of course, metals, heavy metals, as mentioned, mercury, lead, cadmium, ends up being stored in fat cells, and our brain is, the organic brain is mainly fat. So we want to make sure that nothing is actually being stored in the brain. As a side note, cadmium is really a heavy metal that is accumulated in the brain by smoking. Cigarette smoking. So that's cigarette smoking is not just about being damaging for the lung, but very problematic for the brain. And the last point here, and that is an incredibly important one, pesticides. I think the one that possibly everybody knows about is glyphosate, and that is a pesticide that is incredibly widely used, that has been researched quite a bit, that is very, very, very well known to be incredibly problematic for the human. But for some reason it is still being sold and used. The brand name of that, it's Monsanto, Bayer Monsanto, and the brand name of glyphosate is Roundup. So just so that you know, if I were you, I would not use it anywhere. Even if you would be surrounded by weeds, glyphosate is highly toxic for your brain, so for the whole nervous system, but also the microbiome, the gut microbiome, and that of course drives brain health, but it drives our overall health. So ideally, stay away from anything that looks and sounds like an endocrine disruptor. Next slide, please. So now we're going through a few foods that are very good to support estrogen in our body. So that is very much geared towards perimenopausal women, or actually all these substances, all these foods are really actually very good for not just the female body. I mean, if you look at all these, that is great stuff for the human body in general. I think very specifically soy and other legumes, that's a very interesting field, usually quite hotly debated. Soy contains isoflavones and phytoestrogen, so essentially it's a plant-based substance that behaves like estrogen. So for perimenopausal women, postmenopausal women, that may be a very good thing to level the estrogen in the body. It can be problematic for people that have had a estrogen sensitive breast cancer. Some cancers are very sensitive to soy, so that's why soy is not a no-brainer, and definitely something to know about, to research, and to possibly try out if you're brave, or discuss with your doctor. Flax seeds are naturally very high in omega-3 fatty acids, so it's a vegan omega-3, and is supporting estrogen. Dark chocolate for the brain, I think it is probably the pathway primarily resveratrol, which is a substance that is a very, very potent antioxidant for the brain. And when estrogen has dropped a bit, we need another antioxidant in the brain. So dark chocolate is a very good candidate for that. And below there, these are really items that we know about from the Mediterranean diet in that context. So the Mediterranean diet is really not just about boosting estrogen or balancing hormones. It's great for human health. That's just what it is. It is overall high level, not about pasta and red wine, which is what some people seem to think, but it is very much about high levels of vegetables, some fruit to avoid too much sugar, lots and lots and lots of high quality olive oil, garlic, onion, so these sulfurous vegetables, some oily fish, some chicken, eggs, very little grains. I would highlight very much grains are highly problematic in any context of brain health. So while there are people who are very pro whole grain, I would argue two things: whole grain and highly processed white flour from just wheat are as problematic for the brain, equally problematic in that it's gluten. Gluten is highly inflammatory for the gut, and with that, for the brain. And grains are very high GI. They will turn into sugar very quickly in the bloodstream. And sugar in the brain is, as mentioned with the types before, sugar and dysregulated sugar really leads us to insulin resistance and a high risk of diabetes 2, diabetes 3. So sugar volatility we definitely want to avoid. And so that's why the Mediterranean diet is so wonderful and very, very blood sugar regulating. And one thing with the Mediterranean diet is probably important to mention, there are different schools of thought. Some talk about red meat should be part of the Mediterranean diet in small amounts. There is some data around a very specific compound in red meat that can be problematic in the brain health and Alzheimer's context. And that substance is called homocysteine. So depending on an individual's ability to metabolize homocysteine, red meat may be great or not so great. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So the Mediterranean diet is overall an amazing way to live and to really be kind to your brain and to optimize brain function. On the right hand side, there are a number of supplements, nutrients that are very supportive for the brain. Vitamin D, obviously. So nothing is only supportive for the brain. All this is really supportive for the whole body, for our overall function. but very specifically for the brain. Vitamin D deficiency is, of course, a huge factor, a huge problem in neurodegeneration. So we want to avoid that. And then, of course, it's very easy to do. Get yourself tested and take supplementation to in order to get to a level where you want to get to. As a side note, the vitamin D recommended intake is completely irrelevant. It depends entirely on your very personal way of metabolizing vitamin D. If you take in humongous amounts, but you just cannot metabolize or retain or store it, there's no point in that. So the intake has to be geared towards your ability to metabolize it and what level you're actually at right now. So I would always start with get tested, take a certain amount that will likely get you to the level where you want to get to. But if that doesn't go the way you expect it to, speak with a functional medicine practitioner who will be able to clarify things for you. Another substance that we know about that is great for the brain is omega-3 fatty acids. Vitamin B12, zinc, manganese, these are minerals and vitamins that are incredibly supportive of the whole central nervous system. So very important to ensure sufficient intake or sufficient levels in the blood. Another point here, allium as a supplement. So on the left-hand side, you see above Mediterranean diet, garlic and garlic oil, which is a great substance for brain support. But not everybody is able to actually tolerate that in terms of their gastrointestinal response. So allium is the ingredient or the substance in garlic that is incredibly supportive for the brain. So that might be then an option to take that as a supplement. Red clover, I mentioned here, that is a herb that is, or a plant, that is used a lot in managing the physiological symptoms of menopause. That is really via the mechanism of increasing the estrogen production or retention in the blood. So in that way, that is great for the brain as well. Next slide, please. Sorry. So here is really a summary of all these things that support hormonal balance in terms of what to do and what to avoid. You've seen all of these before. It's always the same story. Avoid toxic things, being that in food and water, and make sure you have enough nutrients and cofactors for your hormones to be metabolized optimally. Sleep, stress, physical and mental exercise, supporting your detox pathways, because we cannot entirely avoid taking in toxins. Social connection, community and purpose, avoiding isolation and such things. So I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think you see it all comes back to certain things are just so incredibly crucial for our body, for our brain, and not only for the female brain, but for all human brains. Things to avoid are really the obvious ones: sugar, smoking, alcohol, the conventional kitchen utensils, as mentioned in the endocrine disruptor slide, the non-organic cleaning products. An important one here, medications and NSAIDs. So NSAID is the abbreviation for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and that is all these OTC painkillers, ibuprofen, paracetamol, aspirin, all these things that people take very lightly and very, very frequently. That is incredibly hard for liver and kidneys to metabolize, to detoxify from. So just to keep that in mind, that should not be the first thing you do when you feel a slight headache coming, but actually check your hydration levels and a few other very obvious things first. Antibiotics, another point very important to keep in mind. I think the overuse of antibiotics has been so widely covered in the media now, just to be very, very sure that if you're being prescribed antibiotics, to be very, very happy with taking them and being very aware of what they will do to your body, to your gut microbiome, and therefore restore your gut microbiome with probiotics. Pesticides, so that's the story about Roundup and glyphosate to avoid in the garden, I would say, at all cost. And mold in the house, and that was mentioned in the types of Alzheimer's. The toxic type mold emits mycotoxins, and these are toxins that we breathe in and that will accumulate in the brain. Mold in the house being the very nasty black mold that can lurk in dark corners in old houses. So definitely something very important to make sure that it doesn't fester, if you will. And next slide, please. So now the last point, really, hormone replacement therapy. I've mentioned or I touched upon that topic a few times. It is not at all a straightforward topic at all. I think HRT is taken by many women in perimenopause and menopause as a tool to alleviate any physiological menopausal symptoms, hot flushes, whatever that might be. In terms of cognitive impact, the results from clinical trials have been incredibly various and very inconclusive. So there's really no straight up way of when to take it, which hormone, whether it should be estrogen or progesterone, or possibly which type of estrogen as well. The timing in terms of where a woman is in progression from perimenopause to menopause is crucial. So there are so many very personalized points that need to be taken into account. So all I want to say here is it's very important for any female to know about it, to do her own research, and to speak with an endocrinologist or a gynecologist very early on, late 30s, early 40s, just to know what the options are, whether it should be synthetic HRT, bioidentical HRT, whether that is an option at all, or whether there are actually natural ways to restore function. It's function as in staying healthy post-menopause. Of course, we will never go back to pre-menopause, but to stay in a healthy, age-adequate way, if that makes any sense. And next slide, please. So this is really just a quick overview of my project. Project name, Let's Make 80 History. You see at the bottom the Viatitude Health Limited logo. That is really the name of my limited company. I've just been granted advance approval by the HMRC for the SEIS tax advantage for private investors. So making a bit of progress there. The project is really all about an algorithmic tool that will give the user tailored food and lifestyle guidance on improving their brain health as is now, and very much with a view to reducing their risk for developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. So it is very much a tool that pulls together all this information that we hear about, see about. Alzheimer's is preventable with food and lifestyle. What does that mean? And that is what this tool will tell the user very specifically. And I think that is now me at the end of this presentation. Do we actually have any questions, Rusha? Rusha, you're on mute.
There you go. I was trying to find the unmute button.
Okay.
So in terms of questions in the Q&A, we've got one question which asks about the isolation being a key layer in Alzheimer's. What I think in terms of that social well-being,
right,
being around people, right?
Right.
If you're slightly more introverted, and what would you sort of recommend? Because how are there any sort of things that you might suggest that could help with growing social? Is it keeping your brain active? Is it conversation? Is there a particular thing that drives that?
There are a number of different aspects of social interaction that is so incredibly healthy for the human body. That is anything from a smile from a stranger that triggers the happiness pathway in the human brain, to human touch. So that literally the very simple touch of another human or a hug triggers the happiness pathway. Being around other humans means simply by breathing, by being around other humans, we exchange microbial diversity of the gut microbiome, and the higher diversity, the healthier the microbiome is, and that again leads to better brain health. So that's another pathway. Of course, for Alzheimer's, the intellectual stimulation, speaking with other people, hearing their ideas, being listened to, is another pathway. So there are various ways. So to your question, people that are very introverted, how they can actually improve or reduce their risk from isolation, that could be a matter of just being around people. And a person who is a very, very introverted person and who is really uncomfortable being around people, that may be a matter of very consciously and carefully building up a relationship with the guy who is running the corner shop. And without a daily quick chat, a smile, some sort of connection. So if a person is incredibly isolated, that may be a very simple way of building very basic human connections, and with that, building more confidence and comfort in actually interacting with humans, and then getting all these incredibly positive results from interacting with humans as the ones that I mentioned before.
Awesome, thank you. And so out of the things that you suggested to eat, so I'm just going to go back a couple of slides, the foods and nutrients and estrogen, is there ever a risk of having too much of any of these?
I think that's an interesting one, and I think there is, so I only have anecdotal evidence, but that's an interesting one. Soy products to be eaten by a male can, if it's eaten in industrial amounts, that may likely lead to imbalance of estrogen and testosterone. I have a friend who is very, very, very much into working out and is totally obsessed with that. And he figured that he is not going to have any whey protein. He is focusing on soy protein. And that led his testosterone level to be unbelievably high. And his hormonal glands being incredibly stressed, because his glands were just constantly working on producing more testosterone to counteract the increased estrogen, and more testosterone, more estrogen from soy. So that is the one thing that as a male, I would definitely watch. If nothing else, checking the estrogen and testosterone, progesterone levels, just to make sure that with excessively high testosterone, that may very likely be a response to excessively high estrogen levels in the male. So that comes back to careful around soy. That's for males for that reason, and for females if they have any estrogen sensitive cancers themselves or in the family. That's really the only thing I would think of.
Great. Well, thank you. That's all the questions. And the final one I thought we'd share with Nian. So I'm just going to spotlight Nian on the stage. So Nian is an old friend from university, and she set up an incredible venture which does a lot of the things that you talked about. It brings women together, it allows a social connection, but I think that's focused on groups who may often feel marginalized or not comfortable going to normal gyms. So yeah, so I'll hand over to Nian to quickly share a little bit more about what she's doing at work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. It was so interesting and definitely important to have as well, that people don't really think about. Yeah, very informative. So a little bit about me. I am the founder of Work Gym. We are a fitness space and community for women in the LGBT community. Our aim is to promote inclusivity in the fitness space, and currently we're hosting quite a few social events that anyone is welcome to come to, as well as several online fitness classes, which include dance, HIIT, strength, and yoga. we are also working towards opening our own facility later on this year. So yeah, I hope you guys are interested in following our journey. You can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or LinkedIn at Work Gym, or you can check out our website as well. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll be sharing more and more stuff with them. I think we're going to plan and do a webinar and collaboration as well. So we'll share more exciting stuff soon. But thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the time, and have a lovely evening. And thank you very much.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Right. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.